Psychology Ninjas here. Today we're looking at biological psychology and the effect of recreational drugs on synaptic transmission, or alternatively, as the specification says, in the central nervous system. This should be considered a theory, and therefore to access your AO1 or your explanation or your knowledge marks, you are looking at explaining key terms associated with that theory, or how this has an impact on synaptic transmission. The first key thing to talk about is the mode of action. This is the way the drug works on the synapse and the brain. And in fact, questions may be described as evaluate the mode of action of 2 or more recreational drugs. So it's really worth knowing this key term. Many of the drugs work by copying or blocking the effects of naturally occurring transmissions in the brain. But most commonly, we're talking about drugs hijacking the reward system or the mesocortical pathway or the dopamine reward pathway in order to produce those pleasurable feelings and associations without actually an external stimuli coming in. There are many different drugs that you can talk about, and none are specified on our specification. So we've gone for 3 different ones here, but you may talk about different ones or have talked about different ones in your own notes and class, and that's absolutely fine. Where we've got cocaine, we're talking about this as an antagonist drug, in that it increases the availability of dopamine and is excitatory. We need to talk about the role in the synapse, and here we're talking about that cocaine as a drug blocks reuptake channels of dopamine, making more available in the synapse, and so it's more likely to cross the synapse and bind to the dopamine receptors on the postsynaptic receptor sites. It's also important here that we can talk about other drugs having other roles. Where we've got heroin, we're talking about that as a depressant. This slows down the central nervous system. Slightly different mode of action here, in that we're talking about it binding to endorphin and enkephalins that are naturally produced and enhancing their action as pain receptors. And so we're having more of a pain receptor response rather than less from this. So we're having more of a pain receptor response, down regulation of our systems, and therefore it's having an inhibitory effect. Where we're talking about the mode of action of cannabis, we're talking about it blocking receptor sites on the postsynaptic receptors, reducing their activity, having more of a calming effect. It also modifies the cellular enzymes, making more excitable and more activity going on in our neurons. Because it's having an action on GABA, which is linked into anxiety and anti-anxiety control, it's actually having a knock-on effect on dopamine because GABA regulates dopamine transmission. It's not having a direct effect on dopamine as we would see with cocaine. It's also important to talk about the fact that there are cannabinoid receptors in various different regions of the brain, particularly the hippocampus. And because it's having an action on these receptors, this is why cannabis has an impact on memory also. What we're talking about next is how we evaluate. And because we've considered this a theory, because we're talking about how an explanation of its actions on the synapse, we would use SODA to evaluate this particular part of the specification. Here we're actually talking about 2 different pieces of research in order to extend that research support. We also want to frame each of our paragraphs in order to ensure that the examiner knows that we're now evaluating, and give mini conclusions in order to access level 4. So how does this break down in terms of this evaluate 8 marker? And you can see here that we've changed that question slightly to talk about evaluate the mode of action of recreational drugs. So in our explanation, we would still be talking about the mode of action. And because of the nature of how research comes together, we would actually recommend that you talk both about the mode of action and the mode of action of cocaine specifically before you go into your first piece of evaluation, using all of that wonderful terminology that we've already talked about. Then you're moving through and talking about research support. You have 2 different pieces of research here, one from Schroeder and one from Straker. And it's entirely up to you whether you substitute these for other pieces of research that you know well. Here we're making our overall conclusion that there is high levels of external reliability because we have consistent findings across different pieces of research. You could have argument and counter-argument here, talking about how animals as participants are problematic. You want to make sure that what you're talking about in relation to animal studies links directly into recreational drug use. Here it's really important that you talk about how the pathways of mice can be manipulated wholesale, whereas this is not true when we're talking about human participants. I would then move on here to talk about correlation versus causation. Much of this research is correlational. We also might talk about biological mechanisms are the same with recreational drugs, however, people's experiences are different. And therefore that physiological differences between people and the way their brain chemistry works, or mediating factors from the environment, might influence these different experiences. You also want to extend this by talking about the complexity of transmission, and the way it works is limited by the current tools that we have to measure. Here we might make a link to PET scans or other scanning techniques which may not be able to see transmission as a process. For example, cannabis limits hippocampal activity but leads to more dopamine activity in the reward pathway. What we might talk about here is that extraneous variables specifically, and you could give one in terms of environment, may have an impact on our experiences. We then move through and talk about this in a much more traditional way, explaining the mode of action of heroin specifically, and then we've got two alternate drugs that we're talking about. One is a stimulant and one is a depressant. And here we go further to talk about that reductionist argument. This is one of my favourite pieces of research from Alexander et al. They compared rats that lived in a boring cage with ones that lived communally in a rat park, where there was lots of external stimuli. What they found was a vast difference in the water that the rats consumed that was laced with morphine. In the rat park, the rats did not consume the water at all, and therefore this supports social explanations having an impact on drug use. We can go further here and talk about the effect of desensitization and tolerance, however, supports these internal processes that the mode of action of drugs can be shown in external observations. Overall, we're talking about a lack of validity in terms of the effect of recreational drugs, and that external stimuli and social explanations have a significant impact on explaining different experiences. Finally, we talk about the mode of action of cannabis, and then we're moving through to our application of knowledge in society. Two different arguments here that we can talk about. We can talk about the fact that Morgan et al. Has seen positives in terms of the pain-reducing effects of cannabis that could be used effectively, or we could go negative in terms of our application for society, in that the overprescription of opioids and the belief that the development of new drugs are not addictive has led to a national public health crisis. Alternatively, we can talk about understanding the mode of action of drugs enables us to block their effects, and naloxone is a really good example of this. In terms of our link, this understanding the mode of action in drugs can help us with treatments, giving credibility to how they work. Let's have a look at some exam questions now. Here we have a 2-mark question, compare the mode of action of two drugs. Where we have a compare question, these are always asking for similarities and differences. And even at 2 marks, you get 1 mark for the similarity and 1 mark for the difference. Let's have a look at another exam question here. Now we've got an 8-marker, and this is a discuss question, which is asking us to explain our knowledge and then apply. We need to explain the effect of recreational drugs on transmission, so that's the same as the information that we've talked about consistently in this video. We then need to apply, and that's for relevant examples for Mrs. Zeke, and she's teaching her students. We also need to be clear about what she wants to include, that we need to have both antagonists and agonists represented, stimulants and depressants, so we'd need to signpost the drugs that we're talking about and how these link into our STEM. Thanks for listening today. Don't forget to like, subscribe and hit that bell.